for the Collegeville area, although I went to Abington High School, graduated in '68. As I was working there, I became a docent. And because I was an elementary school teacher, they seemed to give me a lot of the Cub Scout groups and the school groups to give tours to when I was there. And one of the interesting things was I realized we had a World War II Navy primary trainer, an intermediate trainer, and an advanced trainer there. We had a very beautiful SNJ. And I thought it would be a great idea when I gave the tours to the kids to dress as a Navy pilot. This was about 12 years ago, so I started collecting the World War II pilot gear. So I talked to the kids about it, because a lot of times, when you talk to kids about World War II, you might as well talk about the Civil War. They really have no clue in terms of years. Even the high school kids really don't seem to have a good feeling about when World War II was. And some of them don't even know that their grandparents lived through, or their great-grandparents. So by getting them interested in it, by letting them try on a World War II helmet and the Mae West and things like that, I found that it really helped the tour a lot. The kids seemed a lot more interested. And a lot of the kids went out and learned more about World War II, or wanted to learn more, or talk to their grandparents or great-grandparents about it, because they started with that interest from the tour they got at our museum. We have, at Mid-Atlantic Air Museum, every June, usually the first weekend in June, the largest World War II living history event in the country. It's a wonderful event. And we're one of the few living history events that doesn't just have like a European theater. We actually have a European theater, Mediterranean theater, we have a Pacific theater, and we have a home front. And so when you come to our show, you can bring your grandchildren and show them that when you go into the home front, we have a live radio show that goes on, just like it did during the war. The girls sing the jingles from the different foods. They come out with the news. They have a little like soap opera that goes on there, and it's all live. You have the on-air sign there. We have a 1940s fashion show, which is a really pretty look, where the girls, they're high school girls that had found original 1940s clothing, had them restored, and they wear them at the show. We have over 1,500 World War II reenactors at the show. We have German reenactors, American reenactors, Army. I do Naval Air. We have a group of Marines that come up from the Marine Museum down in Virginia, and they reenact at our show. And they live there. We live there as if it were World War II. We live in our tents. We're not allowed, actually, as a living history group, to show anything that's post-World War II in our camp. So we sort of have to hide the sodas and the coolers and all under tarps and things like that. But when you come there, you'll see what a World War II encampment was. And somebody said, why is the show still open when it rains? Well, I guess if you're a flea market guy, it's not really a good thing. But if you come to the show in the rain, and a lot of people do, we still get, I think one year it rained almost the whole Saturday, and we still had about 15,000 people there that day. And what they saw was how the troops, see, the reenactors have all the equipment, so they could see how the troops coped with the rain. And I was amazed, because I'm like the wimpy Navy pilot with these other fellas. We're in our tent, it's pouring rain outside, and the Marines are outside. Now we're peeking out through our flap in our tent, and here's the Marines standing out there. One guy's eating a can of soup out of it, the thing's filled with water. Another guy's in his dugout, and the whole thing's filled with water. They really live just as if it were World War II, so that people can see what it was like. You could go into the German encampment, and they'll be demonstrating how they changed barrels on their machine guns, and how they cooked food, and what types of foods they had, how they were conscripted into the Army. So it's a really great thing. You go into again in the home front, we have a 1940s house set up in one of the hangars. So it has like the fireplace, it has the star in the window, there's a scrap drive going outside, there's a civil defense guy out there telling you to pull the flaps on your curtains and things like that. So, and what's really neat is that Friday and Saturday night we have a big band show in the hangar, just like the old USO shows. And what's great about it is we have a lot of young kids that are swing dancers. They belong to swing dance clubs that come to the show, although everybody's welcome to get up and dance to the music. But they usually give lessons and things like that. But what's really neat is, normally young people don't mix as well with older people. But these guys wanted to know what were some of the dance steps that other people used then, so they could learn it for their dance club, and so they could do it. And they dress in like zoot suits and things like that. You see the big chains hanging down and things like that. And it's really a neat show in that way. And there's plenty of good food there. And one thing there isn't is a lot of shade because we're on an airport. We did build a pavilion for people, but it usually is a hot day, so I'd suggest you bring an umbrella. Because it's flat, it's good for even those scooters that people have so that you could get around. We also have a large military flea market there that really, it's huge. There must be like 150 vendors in it. We also have a lot of military vehicles. We have like Deuce and a Half, Sherman tank, half tracks. You'll see just about ducks, you know, the old ducks and things like that. So, and there's a group that does a radio, like an Army radio base there. And they actually transmit every Saturday night. The military radio club actually transmits to each other around the area and talks on their old, you know, World War II radios. And so everything is set up. We also have, and this is very unusual, a permanent French village there that has second floors in it that's built on the museum property. It's there all year round. And the reenactors actually skirmish through the town and stay in there. We even have a French resistance group that comes in and finds the German and tries to sneak up. Usually the Germans lose. You know, the reenactors lose when they have the skirmishes. But they all use blanks and things like that. It's really great. Plus you'll see B-17s there. We're trying to get a BF-109 this year. We're trying to get, we've had B-29 at the show, we've had B-24s at the show, P-51 Mustangs, Corsair, Spitfire, Hurricane. So we really try to have it, and we try to put those planes in the areas like the British planes and the British encampment, and the Navy planes, the Pacific encampments, and things like that. Plus, they fly during the day, so it's a wonderful show. Now, if you want to avoid some of the traffic, Friday is a great day to come to the show because there's not as much traffic on Friday. The show is actually Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And we do, so you can get there from, say, 9 o'clock in the morning and stay till 10 o'clock at night by the time the big G-Man shows up. It's really a wonderful show, and I hope you can come. I did bring pamphlets. They're actually last year's pamphlets that I've just changed the dates on it so that you can see it. We don't have this year's pamphlets there yet. I'm going to talk about naval aviation. Now, most people in my generation grew up at a time when our country had the most powerful military in the world. When we went into battle, we usually went in with superior numbers and with up-to-date, highly technical equipment. That's not the way it was when World War II started. And this was very evident in the United States Naval Air Force. And what had happened was during the Depression, there were a lot of cutbacks with the Navy. And the monies that they were given didn't seem to go to the Naval Air Force at that time. And the reason was because aviation was a pretty new thing in the Navy. It had only started around 1917 and into the 20s. And a lot of the people that were interested in aviation during the peacetime didn't advance far enough so that they were the higher up admirals that were making the decisions as to where the money was going to be spent. So there were a lot of cutbacks in the Navy at that time. Now the best example to show you as to how far behind we were in our Naval Air Force when World War II started was the best example would be the fighter squadrons, or the fighting squadrons that we had. Now, to understand the problem that we had, and you have to understand the fighter's role in our Navy combat doctrine until 1943. Now, Naval combat doctrine at the time demanded that every carrier had 4 squadrons on it. There was a scouting squadron, a bombing squadron, a torpedo squadron, and a fighting squadron. They didn't call them fighter squadrons in the Navy at that time. They were called fighting squadrons. Now, it was the scouting squadron's job, and they pretty much flew SBD Douglas dive bombers at that time. The scouting squadrons, it was their job to go out and fly sector searches to try to find the enemy fleet or to look for submarines that may be attacking our fleet. Now, it was the bombing squadron's job, and they also flew SBD bombers. It was their job, once the enemy fleet was found, it was their job to go out and dive bomb the fleet. The torpedo squadron was their job to go out and sink the enemy ships by torpedo. Now, in a perfect attack, what happened was this. The scouting squadrons would find the enemy fleet. They would report the enemy's position and their course and speed back to the carrier. At that time, the bombing squadrons and the torpedo squadron would take off of the carrier. Then the fighter squadron would take off and they would split up. See, the fighter squadrons had two roles. Number one, it was their job to protect the fleet. So they had to fly combat air patrol over the fleet, and especially the carriers, to protect them from maybe any enemy aircraft that were in the area. But they also, their second job, which was also defensive, was basically to protect the torpedo bombers and the dive bombers all the way to the target and back again. Now, as I said, in a perfect attack, what would happen is they would take off. Our fighters would fly high and medium cover for the torpedo planes and the bombers. Now, as they approach the enemy fleet, as they approach the target, and this is in a perfect coordinated attack, what would happen is the dive bombers and the torpedo planes would split off, and our fighter groups would have to split to protect them. The dive bombers would climb to their pushover altitude, which was usually about 10 to 12,000 feet. Meanwhile, the torpedo planes would fly to about 7 miles out from the target. When the torpedo planes were ready, the dive bombers would go into their 70-degree pushover and dive on the enemy ships. Now, the reason they went in first was it was hoped that when their bombs hit that ship, the concussion would disorient any aircraft gunners on those ships, just as the torpedo planes were making their low and slow attack at deck level on the enemy ships. Now, the torpedo planes would attack in twos, and they would attack in their anvil attack. And what that was they would attack on a 45-degree angle to the bow of the ship. Now, why did they do that if they were dropping torpedoes? The reason was the enemy ships weren't going to sail straight when they were being attacked. They were going to be jinking back and forth. And it was theorized that if it jinked one way, the plane that was flying at a 45-degree angle this way would have a side-on shot onto the ship. If it jinked the other way, the other guy would have a side-on shot on the ship. Now, unfortunately, our torpedoes were terrible at that time. We basically used the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, and it had a lot of defects in it at that time. They didn't detonate, they went under the ships, there were a lot of problems with it. But then it was the fighter's job to keep the other fighters from shooting down these planes. Now, if you know the role of the fighter then, the fighter had to have a very powerful engine. Why? It had to be able to climb to altitude, because climbing to altitude was basically life for a pilot. That's how you would escape. You had to follow the other planes in that. It also had to be very maneuverable. And it had to be fast, because you had to keep up with the plane that you were trying to shoot down. And it also had to be armed very, very well. Now, knowing that, I'd like to talk about what our problem was during World War II. Now, most air forces in the world by 1933 had gone to a monoplane or a single-wing fighters. Our Naval Air Force was still flying biplane fighters in 1938, only 3 years before Pearl Harbor. Well, lucky for us that in 1936, under its dual procurement program, let me explain that to you. The dual procurement program, the Navy used that up through Vietnam. The dual procurement program was if the Navy wanted a new aircraft, in this case a fighter, what they would do is they would go to two aircraft companies. They would ask them to come up with a prototype of a fighter. The Navy would take possession of that prototype, test it, and fly both of them, and then they would pick the one that they liked the best. And that's the one they would make the larger contract for. Now, at that time, the Navy went to the Brewster Aircraft Company in New York, and they went to the Grumman Aircraft Company on Long Island in New York. And they asked them to design a fighter. Well, Brewster came up with what it called its F-2A. It was later called the Buffalo. I have a model of one here. Brand new model, I should say. This is what the Buffalo looked like. It had a small engine. It had a large viewing area, but it only had two .30 caliber machine guns and two .50 caliber machine guns. It was heavy, but it seemed to outmaneuver the Wildcat. The Wildcat was Grumman's entry. It was the F4F. The Wildcat didn't seem to turn well, and also when the Navy tested it, there were a lot of problems with the engine. The crankshafts were failing on them. The airplanes would stall out, so they had a lot of problems with the Wildcat at that time. So the Navy first gave their first contract to the Brewster Company. They thought the Buffalo would be the better plane, but the Buffalo, when they had it, proved to be a disaster. For one thing, the Brewster Company production was very slow. In fact, in 1939, they only built 11 Brewster Buffaloes for our Navy. The Navy wasn't happy with that. The plane was heavy, it was underpowered, and had a weak airframe also. And the Navy found that from landing it, those hard carrier landings, when you land on an aircraft carrier, you're basically cutting your engines and slamming down on the deck that's probably rising and falling with the waves. The oleos, or the struts on that airplane, tended to collapse. And to make matters worse, during inspections of the Brewster plants, the Navy found sabotage in there. So the Navy tended to distrust the Brewster Company at that time. Well, what happened? Well, Grumman didn't sit on its laurels. Even though Brewster was carrying the ball at that time, they went back and redesigned the Wildcat. They put a more powerful engine on it, redesigned the tail, and then resubmitted it to the Navy, and the Navy liked what they saw. So by 1941, it was determined that the F4F Wildcat would be our predominant fighter in 1941. Here's a model of the Wildcat. Now, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, our Navy only had 161 front line fighters deployed on its 7 carriers and its 9 squadrons across the country. The Marines only had another 63. So we were very short against the hundreds that the Germans had, the hundreds that the Japanese had built up before the war. So we were very deficient on the number of planes we had. Now let's talk about the Wildcat. The Wildcat was originally being designed by Grumman in 1936 as a biplane again. But when Brewster came out with that single wing design, they decided to change their plans into a single wing plane. Now, the original variant of the Wildcat had a solid wing on it. It was a single wing fighter, but they kept, because it was originally designed as a biplane, they kept the wheels and the fuselage as the biplanes had, not out on the wings. And this made for a very unforgiving landing when they landed, because the wheels weren't that wide. They tended to tip one way or the other. Now, it was armed very well. It was armed with 4 .50 caliber machine guns, and each machine gun had about 450 rounds per gun. Now, you know that you watch these movies with John Wayne flying and all, and they're firing and firing at the enemy planes. If a pilot with 450 rounds, if he fired all his guns at once, he only had 36 seconds of burst before he ran out of bullets. Now, the Wildcat's engine was a Pratt Whitney 1830 engine. It had 1,200 horsepower, and it had a top speed actually of about 340 miles per hour. It had a range of about 880 miles, which in world standards at that time was average, basically. Now, to save on weight, the landing gear, rather than put in a hydraulic landing gear, Grumman decided to put a hand crank in there. And you can often see the Wildcats, when they took off, waggling like this a little bit as they took off. And the reason is that the Navy pilot had to switch his hands because the crank was on the starboard or right-hand side, so he had to switch hands to his left-hand side. As he cranked it, he tended to waggle the stick a little bit, it tended to wobble when it took off. Now, any Wildcat pilot will tell you it took exactly 28 cranks to crank those wheels up because their arms were really hurting when they did it. And it took a long time to do that. You had to crank them up fast because you had to get altitude and get speed, and it slowed you up. Now, the first models were delivered still in the peacetime in the summer of 1940. Now, they lacked armor plating. Grumman hadn't thought to put armor plating in it. They didn't have bulletproof glass, and they had aluminum fuel tanks. Now, in November of 1941, though, based on the recommendations from Claire Chennault, who was fighting in China with the Flying Tigers, And also with our European observers, it was determined that we should put bulletproof glass, pilot armor around the pilot, and self-sealing fuel tanks in the airplane. They should be retrofitted into the ones that were already delivered and put in at the factory for the ones that hadn't been delivered yet. Now let me explain to you what a self-sealing fuel tank is. An aluminum fuel tank is metal. You know what aluminum is like. So when you put a bullet through there, a hole opened up, fuel spilled out, and you had a good chance of having a fire. In fact, many times with a bullet slamming into that tank would blow it apart. They came out with a rubber bladder, which was like a bag. It wasn't solid, and it wasn't in an aluminum tank. They didn't want it touching any metal because they wanted it to absorb the shock of the bullet going through it. But a self-sealing fuel tank worked because it was made of two laminated rubbers. One was a vulcanized rubber, and the other one that was laminated to it was an unprocessed rubber. So what happened is when the bullet went through there, the fuel would eat away the non-vulcanized rubber, the unprocessed rubber, and it would melt and seal up the hole. And that's basically what they tried to install in there. Now, unfortunately, the problem was that when they added that armor, it added more weight to an already heavy aircraft that had to be fast and maneuverable as a fighter. By adding the rubber bladder didn't hold as much fuel as the aluminum fuel tanks, and it was heavier. And of course, the bulletproof glass even added weight to the plane. And every time you added a pound, you were sacrificing performance in that plane. Now, the top speed on the Wildcat, after all these things were added, instead of it being 340 miles per hour, was only 318 miles per hour. Its range, which is out and back to the target, instead of being 880 miles, was now only 770 miles. Now, you realize it seems like 770 miles is a long way. But if you realize that you're taking off from the carrier, going to the target, and if you enter in combat there, you're using up a lot of fuel in that combat, and you still have to have enough fuel to get back to the carrier. So the combat radius, or the distance from the carrier to the target, was only about, all you could have is about 275 miles before you had to come back or you'd run out of fuel. So that's not very far when you look at ocean, look at an ocean and how far the fleets may be apart. So that was a big problem. Now, what was the plane we were going to be up against? I tried to hang it on my belt. Not too fat. Sorry. It's probably all. That'll work. All right. The plane that we would be mostly up against was the Mitsubishi A6M0. Now the Zero had an excellent range of about 1,190 miles as opposed to the 770 miles that our Wildcats had. It was powered by a Nakajima radial engine that had about 1,130 horsepower, about the same horsepower as our Wildcat had. It had a top speed of about 325 miles an hour, which again wasn't that much different than our Wildcat. But it could outturn and outfly just about any plane that it was up against. It also had good firing power. It had two 7.7 machine guns on it. Now they didn't do all that much damage. The holes that they made in our self-sealing fuel tanks could be sealed up again with a bullet this size, and they wouldn't go through the armor that we had for our pilots. But they also carried two 20-millimeter cannons on there, in which the shell at the end exploded when it hit. These could do a lot of damage. Now, reports that we were getting from China about the Japanese planes were very good, but our Navy sort of looked at them, well, the Chinese aren't really trained as well as we are, and their airplanes aren't as good as the planes that we have in our Navy, and things like that. But early in 1942, when we first went into combat against the Japanese planes and against the Zero, our pilots were very surprised. I've read some briefing reports of some of these pilots when they came back from a mission. They asked them what they estimated the top speed of a Zero was, and some of them estimated it was like 100 miles an hour faster than what it could actually do. And it was because it could outturn us. Our pilots found they could never dogfight a Zero. because as soon as you got behind that zero to try to shoot him down, he would go into a left-hand turn because of the torque of his engine. A left-hand turn was, he could do a tighter turn that way. And if you followed him into that turn outside the second loop, he was behind you shooting at you because he could out-turn you that much better. They also could climb faster than airplanes too, A lot of times if they followed a zero, he would go into a climb and he'd still have power where our planes would stall out, and then as we fall down, the Japanese pilot would just kick his tail around and come down and shoot our planes down. So the Zero was a really great airplane for the Japanese, and we didn't know why at the time. Now, what our pilots were told to do was, rather than get behind the Zero and try to shoot it down, was to use hit-and-run tactics, basically. To get altitude, make an overhead pass on it, gain speed, and then come up, make another pass, and then pretty much get the hell out of there before the Japanese plane came and shot it down. Now, the Wildcat had one thing going for it, however. It was now well armored. In fact, Grumman became known as the Ironworks because they built such a solid plane that could take a lot of hits. The F-4F-3, the initial plane we had, was the airplane that our Navy had upon entering World War II. It was used and flown at Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, and at the Battle of Coral Sea. Now, in 1941, the Bureau of Aeronautics went to Leroy Grumman. See, up until that point, our carriers could only carry 18 Wildcats on them because they didn't have any more room in their hangar decks for any more planes. So our Navy went to Leroy Grumman and asked if there was a way he could fold the wings on the Wildcat so that they could fit more of them and increase the number of planes for a fighting squadron to go on. Well, Leroy Grumman was a wonderful engineer. He sat there at his desk and he pulls out an eraser and he pulls out 2 paper clips and puts them in the eraser so it looks like a little airplane, and he tried to theorize the best way he could fold those wings. We said, well, you know, if I fold the wings this way, that's where all the stress is on the wing. So he came up with a method of, after the plane landed, of course, of folding the wings up and then pulling them back against the fuselage. You can see how much more narrow that plane is once you fold those up. So instead of having a wingspan in the hangar deck of 34 feet, it now had a wingspan of 14 feet. And you could fit 5 Wildcats in the same space that you could fit 2 in before. Now, around that same time, the British, who were flying Wildcats in their British Air Arm, in their Fleet Air Arm, they wanted a 5th and 6th gun on the plane. Instead of having 4 machine guns, they wanted 6. Well, our Navy pilots, they didn't really want 6 guns. They figured if you couldn't hit an enemy plane with 4, you're still not going to hit them with 6. They also knew it was going to add more weight to the airplane. But Grumman went to the Navy and they said, look, I can't build one model for the Navy and another model for the British and still keep my production numbers up. So the next model that they came out with was the F-4F-4, which had a folding wing mechanism, and it also had 6 machine guns in it. Now, by putting the folding wing mechanism in there and the 5th and 6th machine gun, it added another 700 pounds to an already, and so the performance of the F-4F-4, even though it was a newer model, was worse than the F-4F-3. Most of the pilots preferred the old models. You might say, well, why didn't the pilots want extra machine guns? Well, one of the problems with this model was that by adding the 5th and 6th machine gun and the folding wing mechanism, they didn't have as much room for ammo. So instead of having 450 rounds per gun, they only had 240 rounds per gun.
Joseph Colby.
Now,
would they please come to the circulation desk? Mr. or Mrs. Joseph Colby, please come to the circulation desk. Thank you.
Now, if a pilot fired all his guns at once, he only had 16 seconds of burst before he ran out of bullets. So you had to be pretty darn sure your bullets were going to hit the target before you fired your gun. So that was the main problem. So you wonder, how did our Navy get through the first year and a half? Because we didn't have the Corsair yet. We didn't have the Hellcat yet. We didn't have the better airplanes. We were still developing those. How did we hold the line against the enemy until those more pilots could be trained, and until we could build better aircraft. Well, I've done a lot of research on this, and I found it was a combination of 4 factors. It was a combination of the tactics we used, the training we had, good old American ingenuity, and luck, and I'd like to explain those to you. First, I'd like to talk about training. Until 1939, October of 1939, our training program took a full year for a pilot to go through his primary, basic, and advanced training. But in that time, he had about 300 hours of flight time, which was more than most other air forces at that time. Now, Admiral Halsey then took over the training at Pensacola. He condensed the program, foreseeing a war coming, I guess, to 6 months. But he still made sure the pilots had 207 hours of flying time before they graduated. Now, our squadrons were also led by lieutenant commanders, or their equivalent of majors in the Marines. Now, most of these fellas, when the war started, were academy graduates at that time. They had gone to through the Navy Academy. They also, to go into flight training, had to serve 2 years on a ship as a line officer before they were allowed to go into aviation training. So most of these guys knew how to lead other men, and they knew how to instill respect in them. In fact, one of the commanders had what he called his humility squad. He had a group of pilots that had a lot of experience. So when these young bucks came out of Pensacola, these new trained pilots, they thought they could shoot anything down, and you can't tell me what to do, I'll get them, I know what to do. Well, what he would do is he'd put his experienced pilots up against these new young kids, and he'd say, okay, you get behind and try to take advantage of these other pilots. Well, these kids would try to get behind these other pilots and try to get to a position where they could shoot them down, and these other pilots would pull alongside of them when these guys didn't even know where they were. And the guy would be sitting there smoking a cigarette or eating an apple in his airplane just to humiliate these new pilots. So that they could see they could easily be shot down by a more experienced pilot. And what it did is it made these fellas listen a lot better to the guys that had experience and follow orders a lot better at that time. And so these leaders knew how to do that. Another part of our training that really helped us was our gunnery training. Most air forces in the world, especially in their fighter squadrons, taught dogfighting as the main mode of attack. Well, in dogfighting, you get behind the enemy plane and follow him move for move, so when you shoot your bullets, they go straight out and hit the enemy plane. Well, as I said, the Wildcat wasn't a dogfighter. Luckily for us, and for some reason the Finnish Air Force, and when I do my research, used deflection shooting as their main mode of attack, not dogfighting. Now, deflection shooting is a lot harder than dogfighting in a lot of ways. Why? Because you have to attack on an angle, which is a lot safer because the guns aren't pointing right at you, especially if you're following somebody and there's a tail gunner in that plane. It's a lot harder because you have to attack at an angle and fire your bullet. So you never actually put the center of your sight on the plane you were shooting down. You put it ahead of it. So you put that pip or that center dot ahead of that plane, but you had to gauge the actual speed and the angle of attack that you had so that when you fired your bullets, your bullets would be where that plane was going to be when those bullets got there. So one of the first things they used to teach our pilots was skeet shooting, because you had to learn how to lead a clay pigeon when you were shooting at it. Our Navy pilots had a lot of training in deflection shooting and became very good at it, and that helped us out a lot. Now the next thing was tactics. You'd think a teacher would never get to ride the road because a lot of them. Our tactics. Most air forces in the world flew in a three-man section, or element. In the Air Force, we call them elements. In a three-man section, you had one leader who flew out front and two wingmen behind him. It was the leader's job to go out and shoot down the enemy, because it was usually the most experienced pilot. It was the two wingmen's job to weave back and forth behind him and keep an eye on his tail, so that he didn't have to worry about somebody sneaking up on him from the back, and he could go out and shoot the enemy down. Well, as I said, we didn't have enough planes when World War II started. And actually, before World War II, our pilots knew that. Some of the squadron leaders went to Admiral Halsey and they said, we would like to experiment, if we could, with a two-man section. See, they theorized that if they used a two-man section instead of a three-man section, it would free up 50% more planes to be attackers. Well, Admiral Halsey figured, well, if everybody else is using a 3-man section, why should we change? But these guys kept on him about it. So he finally relented by leaving it at the discretion of the squadron leaders. If they wanted to try a 2-man section, he said they could. One of those squadron leaders was a guy named John Thatch. Everybody called him Jimmy. Now, John Thatch at the time was the squadron leader of Fighting Squadron 3, the Felix the Cat Squadron. They were stationed at North Island, San Diego Naval Air Station. Well, when he was at his home, he was sort of like a high school football coach. You know how a football coach will go home and he'll figure out, like, on a piece of paper, a new play that he could use? Well, Jimmy Thatch would do that with his airplane tactics. He would sit there with matchsticks on his kitchen table and try to figure out a way he could use this new 2-man section, both defensively and offensively, against the enemy. So what he would do is he'd try to figure out a way that he could do it, then he'd go out to the field and get his guys to fly what he was trying to see if it was a good defensive maneuver or an offensive maneuver. And eventually he came up with what he called his beam defense. Now, flying a beam in the Navy, or sailing a beam, means flying parallel to the ship. Well, what he theorized was that if he and his wingman flew side by side at a distance that either one of them could fly a normal radius turn into each other, they could keep an eye on each other's tail. If either one of them or both of them got an enemy plane on their tail, a signal would be made and they would immediately turn towards each other. Now that does 2 things. If you're an enemy plane following somebody trying to shoot him down, he goes into a turn and throws your sights off. And number 2, while that enemy plane is concentrating on shooting that guy down, you're setting him up for a good deflection shot from your wingman that's crisscrossing over there. So what they would do is they would crisscross, your wingman would get a shot at him, and then if he didn't get him, they would weave back again and make another shot until they got him. When that tactic was first used at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, and from then on, our kill ratio against Japanese planes went from 2 to 1 to 4.5 to 1. It was an almost infallible maneuver because it protected our pilots, yet as a defensive play, but it was also an offensive play because it set him up for an attack by the wingman. And it really worked very well. So that was something that eventually, when he saw how well it worked, he wrote a letter, and I have a copy of a letter that he sent to the Bureau of Aeronautics, telling this thing really works. We should teach this to all the pilots back at Pensacola. Eventually, it was made part of the syllabus, and it's still taught to fighter pilots today. It's now called the Thatch Weed, by the way. You may have heard of that. Now, I also said luck had something to do with it. In June of 1942, the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands as a diversionary thing, and they took a couple islands there along at the same time that they were attacking the Battle of Midway. They had hoped maybe some of our fleet would go up to Alaska, I guess, and wouldn't go to Midway, but we surprised them there. Well, they set up an air base up there, and they had a group of Zeros there. And one of the Zero pilots, a petty officer first class, Koga Todayashi, was flying his Zero, and a PBY was there, and he was making shots on this PBY, and the PBY waist gunner shot at him and shot out the fuel line on his engine. So his engine sputtered and died. Well, Koga decided he was going to land in this field that he saw down below. So he lowered his landing gear, and as he landed, it turned out to be a marsh, not a field. So what happened is his wheels hit, he nosed up, broke his neck, and he was killed. The airplane flipped over. So what happens? About 3 weeks later, one of our PBYs, flown by a pilot named Bill Dees, was flying over the area, and they look down and they see these 2 red spots down. They look down, what do they see? They see this Japanese plane laying there. So they took pictures of it. The pictures go all the way back to Washington. And they said, this is a Zero. We have to get that plane out of there. We hadn't had it caught or captured a Zero at that point. We wanted to know, why did this plane outfly us in almost any maneuver that we made? So they sent submarines in, they finally got the Zero, and they brought it back to San Diego. So what do? Well, we put our engineers on it. The engineers take the plane apart, and they find out that its framework, instead of being aluminum like our planes, was magnesium, which is what made it a very light aircraft. But we also know that magnesium burns. We saw that the fuel tanks were right at the wing roots of the airplane, right here. And they were aluminum. They weren't self-sealing fuel tanks. We also noticed that the pilot had no armor. So this was a very light aircraft. We also noticed it had very large ailerons. Now, ailerons are the flaps on the wings, so that when you move your stick to turn your plane left or right, the one aileron goes down, the other one goes up, and that's what helps you determine. The ailerons on that Zero were very large. So what do they do then? Well, see, by the way, the reason it was like that, why it wasn't armor plated, is the Japanese theorized that they could make a plane that was powerful, light, and maneuverable. They'd always be on the offense. They would never be on the defense and wouldn't have to take a lot of hits. So that's what their theory was. Well, what do we do then? Well, they put the plane back together, put American markings on it, and they fly it against some of our best pilots, our Navy and Air Corps pilots, flew against it. And I talked to one of those Navy pilots that flew the Zero to see what it would do. And I said, the guy's name was Bill Leonard. He's buried at Arlington. But before he was very helpful to me in doing a lot of research, because he had been at the Battle of Coral Sea, been on Midway. And Bill, after he came back from the Battle of Midway, was in San Diego and got to test the Zero when they brought it in. I said, well, what would it do? He said, well, Jim, it outflew anything we had in the Navy. It was really fun to fly. But he said, I found one weakness. If I put that Zero into a dive, a power dive, the ailerons on it, which really helped you to turn really well, were so large that the forces of air going over almost made the stick like concrete. I could hardly pull back on that stick. All I could do was get both hands on it and pull back. So how do we use this information? Well, number one, we tell our ordnance men in the Navy to put an incendiary or hot round in about every 5th bullet of the machine gun bill. We tell our pilots to aim at the wing roots of the plane because we know that's where the fuel tanks are. And we know they're not armored. And if you ever get a Zero on your tail, go into a power dive and turn out, and the chances are the Zero won't be able to keep up with you. And this saved a lot of our pilots also. So it was a combination of the training we had, with the deflective shooting, the tactics, the good old ingenuity of guys like John Thatch, who came up with the beam defense, and the luck of finding that Zero that really helped us hold the line against the Japanese. There was a fellow named Jim Flatley, who was a contemporary of Jimmy Thatch. In fact, they were good friends. And one of his guys came up to him and said, why are we still flying these Wildcats? He said, you know, the Marines are getting these Corsairs now. Why aren't we flying those yet? And his answer was, let us not discuss the inadequacies of our equipment. It shoots the enemy down in flames and brings most of us back alive. And he said, I guess that's all you could ask of a good fighter. And that was his answer to that. And I also found some other things in my research that maybe some of you didn't know. You know, you're all World War II buffs, I'm sure. One thing I found out was that once the war started, our squadrons weren't assigned to a particular carrier. They were pretty much independent. The air groups were independent of the carrier. They weren't part of the crew, basically. Early in the 30s, they were. You had the Yorktown Air Group, the Ranger Air Group, and so on. But once the war started, the groups were just assigned to that carrier. So when if that group had a lot of planes shot down, or a lot of pilots lost, or they were exhausted from flying so many missions, they could be pulled off once they came back to Pearl Harbor, and another fresh squadron could be put on. The Japanese didn't work it that way. The Japanese kept their air groups were part of that carrier. So if somebody was shot down or they lost a lot of planes, all they could do is to bring replacements into that squadron. And as more and more, the more experienced guys were killed, they had more and more less experienced guys flying in that group. Another thing that was a problem for the Japanese, most of our pilots were officers. Now, we did have an enlisted pilot program. They were called NAPs. It was started in the 1920s. And the NAPs, or the Naval Aviation pilots, that were officers, they were mostly machinist mates and chiefs. Most of these fellas were commissioned by 1943, especially if they were in carrier air groups. The Japanese, see, so most of our, if you had a squadron, most of the guys were officers. The Japanese didn't work it that way. Because they were part of the ship's crew, they might have had a commanding officer, an engineering officer, an intelligence officer, let's say, but all the guys under them were petty officers. It was run just like a division on a ship was. So what happened was, is like some of these petty officers for the Japanese became aces. They were very good, but they could never become a squadron leader, even though they had all that experience, because they were only petty officers and they weren't officers, where our guys could. We could take advantage of the experience that our pilots had and send them back to Pensacola so they could train the young pilots using their experience and what they had seen against the Japanese. So are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
As I remember, I was didn't go in the service in 51, but I remember the Zero from my studies. And the Zero had a landing gear that didn't retract.
Yes, it
Is
did.
that right?
No, it did. The Zero's landing gear did retract. However, there were other Japanese fighters where it didn't. And believe it or not, we did tests on those planes. And aerodynamically, those planes were pretty good, even with the landing gear that didn't.
Because I was going to ask if they did, I thought they did retract. My question would have been, didn't that affect the maneuverability? But you said how maneuverable it was.
It was very maneuverable and it didn't have that. But some of the other Japanese fighters did have landing gear that didn't retract. The Japanese didn't want to add that extra weight to their airplanes by putting in a hydraulic thing. Now the Japanese Zero did have a hydraulic landing gear that recessed, yes. Any other questions? Yes.
When was the first Corvair
Corsair?
landed at Fort Island?
Yes. The first Corsair landed in Fort Island early in 1942. It was actually developed in 1941. And the Navy had them on the East Coast here. But they didn't get out to the Pacific till later. In fact, the Corsairs didn't really even get into combat until November of 1942 at Guadalcanal. It was the first time they went into combat.
The reason I asked you that question, I was at Pearl Harbor in 1940, and I swear to you that there was a Corsair I turned in as coming into Fort Island.
Well, you know, it's funny you should mention that. I just read in a book called The First Team about one of the prototype Corsairs was brought out to the West Coast, but I didn't hear it had gone to Hawaii. I heard it went to California. But I didn't hear, maybe unbeknownst to the author, but I had never heard that it had gone there that early.
Well, I was stationed I was in the aircraft Alpha,
Uh-huh.
but I was stationed at Westlock,
Mm-hmm.
and we had to report the planes coming in 1940.
How about that? And there was a Corsair at that time. Yeah, I'm very surprised. Yeah.
No.
Yes.
I heard the Navy didn't get
Well, there were two problems with Corsair. The Corsair was a wonderful plane. It had a big 2,000 horsepower engine and a big 13-foot prop. The prop was used, and that's one of the reasons that the Corsair had that inverted gull wing. I have a model, but I didn't get it out. It had an inverted gull wing design so that it could use a standard landing gear underneath, but could raise it up enough to clear that 13-foot prop. Now, the Corsair had a large engine, but they decided that it would eat so much fuel to give it more range, they needed more fuel capacity in it. So what they did is they moved the cockpit back 9 feet and put a large fuel tank in the nose, which made the nose very long. So, but that wasn't the only problem. See, when a pilot was landing at that time, they were coming in, they had to be able to see not just the deck, you had to see the LSO that was landing in with his paddle. He would tell you if you were coming in the wrong way, and he would wave you off if you weren't. So the Navy didn't like landing it with that long nose they couldn't see. If you look at the Wildcat, you can see it has a pretty short nose on it so the pilot can see. But another problem it had were the oleos, or the landing gear. See, when Vought built that, when Chance Vought built the Corsair, they knew it was one of the first planes that they had that was going to land on an aircraft carrier, and other than a dive bomber that they were building. So they built it very strong, but they made the landing gear too tight. So what happened is when the Corsair would come in, it would bounce as it hit the deck on that hard thing and bounce over the barriers and either break the tail hook, and then they would crash into the planes up front. So what they did is they gave most of the Corsairs to the Marines who were land-based. The Marines always seem to get the dregs. If any of you were Marines, I'm sorry, but that's what they did. In fact, the old Brewster Buffaloes that they had that they didn't like went to the Marines, and the Navy got the new Wildcats and gave their old Buffaloes to the Marines at that time.
The British not on the land worked.
Yes, I was about to mention that. The British came up with a way, because they also flew the Corsairs. The British came in with a way of coming in on a steep angle to the flight deck and then side-slipping the plane in. And at the last, so it was only at the last minute they couldn't see the LSO on the deck when they landed. They also, it was one of our land-based groups, VF-17, decided to take some of the oil out of the struts. And it made them so that they landed a little bit more cushier, didn't bounce as much.
How much training did they have aboard carriers?
How much what?
Training did they have aboard carriers?
Training?
Training.
They had quite a bit. In fact, their squadron leaders, they did have the fuel, and the Navy wanted to keep their guys active. They would fly missions, and in fact, one of the missions they had was like in dive bombing and strafing. What they would do is they'd take one plane up with a big windsock. So a lot of the carriers actually had an SNJ or T6 on there that they would pull a windsock on, and then the planes would dive at that. And by the way, it's kind of interesting how they did that. Like 5 or 6 planes would dive. Well, you know, if you were like me and you were the pilot, you'd say, hey, all those holes in that windsock were mine. You guys all missed. But what they did is they dyed the bullets a different color that were put into different planes. So like my plane would have red dye bullets, somebody else would have green, somebody else blue. So what they did is they counted the holes of a certain color, because it would stain the sheet as it went through, and then divided by 2, because it was like a tube, so you had to divide by 2, and that's how they would figure out how many bullet holes you got. They also had, for dive bombing, they pulled a big telephone pole, basically, behind the ship. And the planes were told not to hit that telephone pole because of the splinters. And sometimes the pilots got so good they could do that. Sometimes they were bad. In fact, there's one case, I think I saw it in a movie, where the guys weren't even close to shoot this thing. And Halsey's looking at it, and they said, tell that guy he couldn't hit a bull with a broom in the back end. Or something like that. Any other questions? There was a question over here.
The Jabs not only had light armor on the planes, but as you were talking, I was thinking back, I was a young kid on Okinawa, ready to go to Japan. And when the war ended, I went up my LSD, I was an advanced diesel mechanic, and I went to Yokosuka Navy Yard and took over the Japanese light cruiser, Sagawa. From there we went to the Weetalk to get rid of it, the atomic blast. And I was surprised because inside, just where the waterline was, it had about 3/4 of an inch armor. That's all I had. And the ship had 4 diesel engines, 4 screws, and I was told by the officer it could do over 40 knots an hour, and that's why.
How about that? Well, what I did find out was, even though we improved our planes as the war went on, so did the Japanese. They added more power to the Zero. They added, by the end of the war, the Zeros, they were starting to put armor plating in them, self-sealing fuel tanks, as they were in their other fighters. They had actually better fighters than the Zero by the end of the war. But the Japanese were improving their aircraft as the war went on. They decided to go from the 7.7 millimeter to a 12.7, which is very similar to our 50 caliber, because they saw our planes were doing so well, but they figured they'd do the same. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the equipment the pilots had. Now, this was a helmet. Now, today when you think of a helmet, you think of something hard. How am I doing on time? Am I getting late or? Brandon? I'm not too late yet?
No, not at all.
All right. This was a helmet used by pilots early in the war, and actually a little bit before the war. It was an M450 helmet. This was a summer wing helmet. The winter wing helmets were leather and had like a fur lining to them. And I've worn this at air shows. And the headphones are in these cups on the side. They, you just put them in, snap them shut, and the line goes around here. By the way, when I got this helmet, it has an extension cord that has a regular RCA plug that the pilot would plug into his instrument panel. I plugged it into my stereo at home. And you'd think after 65 years, darn if these headphones don't still work. I wonder if you buy headphones today at Radio Shack with 65 years from now, it still work. Well, from wearing these things at those headphones against your ears, by the end of the air show, when I was giving talks and stuff, my ears were killing me. So I went to this pilot and I said, how did you wear these all day? He said, you know what we used to do? She said, we used to write our girlfriends back in the States and have them send us their powder puffs. And we used to sew those inside. And that's what cushioned their ears. Well, they must have complained a lot because later in the war, I have a late war helmet here, that the Air Force used the same type of helmet. It has like a cushy chamois line cushion for your ears. By the way, those headphones work too. It's amazing. These are the type goggles that the pilots had early in the war. They were glass. They had glass in them. They had like a rubber cushion that had like chamois on it, so it kept nice and cool. And they're pretty comfortable. They're made so that these little furrows at the end can pop out. They came with 3 lenses. There was an amber lens, there was a green lens, a green tinted lens, and a clear lens. So I guess depending on what time of the day you were flying, you put a different lens, a different color lens in there. It was very easy to change. But they were issued with those. Later in the war, pardon me?
Are they polarized?
No, they're not. Later in the war, they came up with a plastic lens that gave a lot more view, but I talked to some of the pilots, the older pilots preferred their old goggles. They didn't want to go, the younger pilots went to the newer goggles at that time. The Mae West changed during the war. When you come up later, you can see the old Navy Mae West was a wraparound Mae West that actually went over right to the sides of your body. What happened was, as the war went on, it wasn't efficient to have one type of equipment for the Navy and a different type for the Army. So what they did is they came up with equipment that had an AN, Army Navy number. A lot of the later equipment you'll see has AN and then the number for that type of article. And because it was a lot easier for them to do it. So this is a light war when it's very similar to B-4 that the Air Corps used. And then what would happen is when you landed in the water, you pulled these 2 cords at the bottom and they inflated 2 chambers in there with CO2, the little CO2, like almost like what a BB gun would have, I guess. A little CO2 canister in there. Right here, I have a backpack. Probably me. I have a backpack. Now, when a pilot got into his plane, there were no cushions in the seats. I was telling somebody this earlier. So you sat on your parachute and your paragraph kit that was there. That was on the seat part of your parachute. In fact, they got kind of heavy, so they came up with this quick release system where there were 2 clips on your harness. So all you had to do was, you kept the parachute and stuff in the plane. All you did was when you sat in, you clipped into your plane handler, helped you clip into your parachute and your raft. Now, the raft kit had like some water in there. It had some food pellets. It had a bullet hole. There's like a wooden cone-shaped thing with grooves in it that you would screw into a bullet hole in your raft. And it had the oxygen, or the air bottle that would blow up the raft, the CO2 bottle. Now, what they found though was there wasn't enough equipment in there to keep the pilots alive, because some of these guys were in a raft a long time, like up to a week before they were being picked up. There was also a fishing kit in there. So they came up with a backpack that took the place of the pad that was on your parachute. They wore this backpack underneath, and in there, and this is kind of neat, this is part of the fun of having a collection. When I got this, it was empty. And what's neat is I had to find the right things that would go in it. There's different pockets in there. If you didn't get the right thing, it didn't fit. So what was in there was there's a poncho in there. And if you notice, it's yellow on one side and blue on the other. And that's if you're in enemy territory, you put the blue side out, because you'd be harder to see in the ocean. You put the yellow side out if you wanted to be seen more. It also has elastic in the front and the back. You can drape over the front and the back of your raft and just have your head sticking out with the hood on. You also had some protective gloves, and you had a mosquito head net, because if you made it to one of the islands, you know how it is like on a Saturday morning when you're cutting the grass, all those gnats get in your face? Well, the bugs did that like on these islands as soon as you started to sweat. So they had this mosquito head net that tied around your neck that kept the bugs off your face. There was also a machete in there for cutting down the jungle growth. There's a pocket for that. There was a signal mirror. Now this is kind of interesting. Both the Air Corps and the Navy carried basically the same signal mirror. They were all made by the General Electric Company. And they said they would shine up to 10 miles away even on a hazy day. And the way they worked, where you would hold it up to the sunlight. Let's suppose you saw a ship on the horizon. Yes? Oh, you want me to? Put your hand up. Well, what they would do is they'd see a ship on the horizon or an airplane flying. You'd hold it up to the sun. And if you look there in the back, can you see that cross? Well, that cross is like a window, so the sunlight goes through that cross. And you can look through this mirror and you can see where that lighted cross shows up. Some pilots will put it on their cheek, some pilots on their shoulder. Well, if you lined up that lighted cross on you with this cross, and you can see through that cross the item, it was definitely shining on that thing that you were trying to signal. It wasn't a hit or miss thing. You just tried waiting around and hope that we get there. And I tried it at my neighbor's house. My neighbors are now blind now and don't leave the house unless they have sunlight, but it really does work. So, they also had matches in there for the pilot, and they were waterproof so that you could light them even if they were wet. And they had sort of like a dual purpose. There was a compass at the top of it, so you could use that to help find your way. You had a burning glass for starting fires. And here's what their food was. They had 3 cans made by the Charms Candy Company. And I saw one opened up. I was afraid to open one up. But they're like the little, the little square candies Charms has? They look exactly like that. There was caramel, there was some that had like citrus and lemon. And what the idea was, it would keep the saliva going on the pilot. They had a lot of calories in them. Plus they had a lot of caffeine to keep the pilot alert, like when he was there. So they had 3 cans of that. They also had a penknife, they had a fishing kit, and this is kind of neat, for signaling at night. It was called a berry shell projector. Now remember, everything had to be small to fit in here. Berry shell looks like a little shotgun shell. I dropped it again. Thanks. That sounds like worse. Here we go. I got it. That's okay. All right, now the way the berry shell would work, as I said, it looks like a little shotgun shell. What would happen is you would load it in the bottom, you'd lock it in, you'd open the safety up. There's like a little safety in here. You'd open it up, pull this plunger down, and you can fire a little fireworks up if you saw like a ship or heard a ship or something like that. And you know, like if you're down the shore, a little light on a ship way out there, you can see. So this would shine pretty far. And somebody told me, they said, well, suppose it was the Japanese. Well, most of the time the pilot was in the middle of the ocean. He didn't really care who was picking them up. He'd rather it be the Americans. But you also had a whistle to signal. If you ever saw the movie Titanic, they used a whistle because your voice very quickly gives out. There was sunburn ointment in there. The sunburn ointment was like a white salve you put all over your face. It was like really greasy, almost like, what was that stuff, Mom? Zinc. It was very similar to zinc ointment, how greasy that is. One other thing is you had 2 cans of drinking water in there. Now they found that the drinking water wasn't enough, so later in the war, in about the same size package, they came out with a desalting kit that they put in there that had 6 plastic bags and a chemical. You'd fill them with salt water, put the chemical in it, would make all the salt drop to the bottom. The pilot said it tasted lousy, but if it saved your life, they drank it anyway. But that's what they came up with later, so it was improved. And a lot of these items, it's funny, I've seen a lot of these items used even up through the Korean War. Just 2 more things. You got time for 2? I know you run out of time. I'm a teacher, I'm winded.
Running time.
It'll be one fast. This is a chit. Pilots in Iraq used chits. It was first used by the Flying Tigers. The Chinese made it for them. This was used by a Navy pilot flying over French Indochina, which is now Vietnam. And what it basically has is it has all the languages of that area. So it has Laotian, it has French, it has Thai, Chinese, Korean, it even has Japanese, because a lot of them traded with the Japanese. And I had somebody translate it for me, and basically what it says, I can only read the French part. It says, I'm an American aviator. My plane has been destroyed. I don't speak your language. My enemy is the Japanese. If you protect me and take me to the nearest Allied military bureau or office, my government will repay you. And our pilots, they gave the people gold pieces because it was like a universal money that could be used for helping our pilots. And they were also, each one of these were numbered to the pilot that carried it, so if they ever found one.
Yeah, it's still numbered today.
They're still numbered today. Pilots also carried a cloth map. And you wonder why cloth? Well, a lot of people said they were silk, but they weren't silk. We lost all those islands where we used to get the silk when the Japanese took over. They were made out of a new thing DuPont came up with called rayon, and which is still being used today, I guess. And basically, they were cloth for 2 reasons. Number 1, if you got it wet, it'd be easier to dry out. Number 2, if you were in enemy territory with it, and you had to read it, it was a lot quieter to open up than a paper map. Now this is a Navy map. They weren't as colorful as the Air Corps maps, but you can see all these lines on there, and they were the currents in that area for the pilots, so they knew about how far and where the currents would take them in their raft, like when they were in their rafts. So that's basically what that was. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Where's the show in Reading?
It's right near Reading Airport. It's at Mid-Atlantic Air Museum. If you have a computer, you can print out the directions. You go. In fact, the pamphlet is the website for World War II. And they have a lot of pictures on there of the different things that go on during the show. I think you'll really enjoy it. You gotta come at least once. So, I think you'll enjoy it. Yes?
How far are they with the Black Widow?
The Black Widow. A lot of people don't know. The Black Widow was a night fighter designed near the end of the war. Well, actually about 1943. They were all mostly painted black. They had a large radar dish in the nose. It was one of the first planes built as a night fighter with radar already in it. Most of our other planes had pods on the wings or something like that. There are only 4 Black Widows left in the world. There's one in Red China, like in some field rusting away. There's one at the Air Force Museum, a static display that doesn't fly. The Smithsonian has one in pieces in their restoration facility in Maryland. And we have one. We got it out of New Guinea around 1981. And we started restoring. It's taken a long time. The fuselage is pretty much finished. Yes?
The Smithsonian P-39 is, no, not P-39, the
P-61?
P-61 is in Dulles.
Oh, it's in Dulles now. It's at the, oh wow, you didn't see that. Oh, wow. We're trying to make the first P-61 that flies. By the way, if you ever saw that movie, The Great Raid, it was about the Philippines where we got these guys out of a prisoner of war camp before the Japanese killed them when they were evacuating the area in 1945. Well, it shows in the movie, it shows a bamboo bomber buzzing in the field. They wanted an airplane to get the Japanese attention while our Marines went in to try to get these people out. They actually used the P-61 in the actual raid.
The book Ghost Soldiers by Andy.
Yes. Very good book. Any other questions? Yes?
How much gold did they give the pilots?
I guess it depended. I never heard exactly how much to pay the truth. I know the pilots themselves actually had like it almost looks like a cardboard thing, and when you open it up, there's like wax in there, and the coins are in the wax. I've seen them in pictures, but so they're almost impossible to find. In fact, the water cans are almost impossible to find, especially these desalting kits, because they had silver in the chemical that makes the salt drop to the bottom. So a lot of guys would buy cases of this after the war and get the silver out of them, I guess. So there's not many of them left. Yes?
Would you mind saying something about the photograph that you have on the wall?
Right here?
Yes.
I was very fortunate to have gotten possession of a Navy fighter's gun sight. You can now, and it also had the light unit, which are very rare. The picture that's here I had gotten out of a book. A friend of mine owns a photograph studio and was able to blow it up to life size. I had it mounted because I wanted a way to show the gun sight as where it was on the instrument panel of a plane. Now, early in the war, when the war started actually in the 1930s, our planes had usually solid ring gun sights. They were metal rings. But what they found was the pilot couldn't focus on a plane in the distance or at infinity and focus on the rings at the same time. He would either focus on the rings or his eyes would focus on the plane, but they couldn't focus on both. Somebody came up with this ingenious, somebody said it was a college professor, of a way of putting a light unit down below, and then inside there's a brass thing that shows, that's cut to show all the different rings in the pipper. It's projected up onto this glass so that when you look at it, it doesn't matter. So when you looked at the solid ring thing, you could look at it from the side and it still looked like you were looking at it straight, so you never really knew. You were looking dead on. On this one, no matter whether if you're looking right or left, that stays at the right spot in there so that when you're firing, that pipper shows you where your bullets are going to go. Now you might say, well, how did they line this up with the guns? Well, the guns were in the wings, and they had adjustment clamps in there. In fact, every time a plane shot its guns, they had to readjust it because the vibration would shake them loose. What they would do is they had this kit, and I had one here. I should have got, wouldn't you know it, like 100 other times I get it out, nobody looks at it. but that there was a bore sighting kit that they used to use. And they would put those in the barrel of the gun, and the bore sight that would slide in the barrel had like a scope that came down with different attachments so that you could look and see exactly what that gun saw. There's a crosshair in there. So somebody down below would tell that guy, they would put a target, let's say, 1,000 feet away. And they'd line up the guy looking through that, would tell the guy to line up the gun and clamp it down when it was right on that target. Now, as I said, a lot of these planes had 6 guns on them. The Hellcat had 6 guns, the Corsair had 6 guns. More of the experienced pilots would have all their guns so that they would, all 6 guns would shoot on one spot. Why? Because they were good at getting up on the enemy and getting real close to them. So when they opened up, all 6 guns pretty much decimated that Japanese plane, or the German plane for that matter. The more or less experienced guys couldn't get up that close, so they would have their guns bore sighted so that the outer guns might converge. So the guns were angled, so their bullets would converge at, let's say, 1,000 feet. The inner guns the middle guns would converge at, let's say, 800 feet, and the inside guns maybe at 600 feet, so they were bound to get a hit at a different distance, even though they couldn't judge what that was. The clamps, I found, were almost non-existent, the clamps that held these in. And the reason is when they scrapped the airplanes, the clamps stayed in them, where they took the gun sights out and put them in warehouses. So some of the gun sights survived, but the clamps didn't. So I was fortunate enough, there are a lot of people out there who love history. I was fortunate enough to find a tool and die maker who, for only like $75 in materials, said, oh, I can make that. And I gave him a picture of what one looked like, and the guy was nice enough to make it for me for that probably would cost me a lot more money than I